All right, let's just jump right in. Picture this. You're sitting at a desk, there's a clock ticking on the wall, and you're staring down at a freshly printed piece of paper. You're taking a test. Look, we've all been there, right? But have you ever actually stopped to ask yourself what the real point of that piece of paper is? Like, are you simply being weighed and measured, or is there some deeper qualitative judgment happening about your future? Well, in today's explainer, we're going to completely demystify the entire world of educational assessment. And to do that, we're going to use a really simple thermometer analogy to break down exactly what happens when we try to quantify human intelligence and learning.
So here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll cover the assessment building blocks. Then we'll contrast how much versus how good. After that, we'll uncover the true purpose of these systems, look at timing through formative and summative evaluation, and finally, wrap things up by comparing metrics and standards.
All right, Section 1, the assessment building blocks, moving from narrow to broad.
You know, in education, people tend to throw around the words test, measurement, and evaluation like they literally mean the exact same thing. But they don't. Actually, think of them kind of like Russian nesting dolls. A test is the absolute narrowest, smallest doll in the set. Simply put, it's just the presentation of a standard set of questions meant to be answered. Going back to our analogy for a second, a test isn't the sickness and it isn't the temperature. It's simply the physical thermometer itself. Its only job is to gather the raw material.
Okay, so now we step one layer out to measurement. This is the actual process where we ascertain the quantity of a thing by assigning a numerical index. Basically, we're comparing an unknown quantity with a known quantity to get solid information. And measurement, it's entirely objective. It's precise, it's scientific, and it absolutely does not change from person to person. If the test is the physical thermometer, measurement is the cold, hard, almost robotic science of reading that thermometer and seeing that it says exactly 101 degrees.
And that brings us to the outermost, widest circle, evaluation. This is the systematic process of collecting, analyzing, and interpreting all that raw information to judge decision alternatives. It's how we determine if our objectives are actually being met. Really, this is where humanity enters the picture. Evaluation is looking at that reading of 101 degrees, then looking at the shivering patient and making the qualitative judgment that, hey, 101 degrees means you have a fever and you're way too sick to go to school today. It's the big so what of the entire process.
Moving on to Section 2, how much versus how good. This is the core distinction.
Now, taking a look at this breakdown, it is absolutely vital we grasp the deep divide between simply measuring data and actually evaluating potential. When you stack them side by side like this, the contrast is actually pretty stark. Notice how measurement uses words like science, objective, impersonal, and occasional, but then evaluation leans heavily on terms like qualitative judgment, subjective, philosophical, and continuous process. Honestly, it's almost like comparing a calculator to a compass.
So the crucial takeaway here is that measurement asks how much, while evaluation asks how good. Measurement is locked entirely in the present moment. It literally only cares that you got 8 out of 10 math problems right at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. Evaluation, though, that's a much larger story. Evaluation looks at that 8 out of 10, remembers that you used to get 2 out of 10, and decides that you're showing immense potential for the future. The thing to remember is that evaluation depends entirely on measurement, but measurement is totally blind to evaluation.
Section 3, the true purpose, going beyond the grade. Let's see how all this builds into the broader toolbox of why educators actually rely on these methods. And really, it begs a pretty fundamental question. Why do we actually do this? I mean, if evaluation is so complex and subjective, why do school systems across the world pour millions of hours into testing and evaluating? Is it really, honestly, just to give a student a letter grade on a piece of cardstock? Well, no, the answer is absolutely not. Evaluation expands way, way beyond the student. Think about it. If an entire class fails a test, evaluation doesn't just point a finger at the kids. It acts as this massive, systemic quality control loop for the whole ecosystem. It appraises the teacher's methods, it checks the supervisor's curriculum, it helps out with pupil-teacher planning, and it highlights whether or not the school is actually meeting its broader community goals. It's not just a grade, it's a diagnostic check for the entire educational ecosystem.
All right, Section 4, formative versus summative. This is all about when we evaluate. You see, educators have to choose their tools based heavily on timing. On one hand, we've got summative evaluation. Think of your classic final exam. It happens at the very end of a course, it provides a final rank, and crucially, the story's over.
There is absolutely zero scope for improvement once it's done. On the flip side, formative evaluation is kind of like getting feedback on a rough draft. It happens during the learning process, giving you continuous feedback while there's still time and scope to actually turn things around and improve.
And finally, Section 5, metrics and standards. This is how we evaluate.
Let's look at the specific lenses through which we view achievement. First up, norm reference testing. This is essentially a competition. Your achievement is evaluated purely against your peers. It's the classic grading on a curve. You know the old joke. You don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun your classmates to get an A. Criterion-referenced testing, however, is completely different. It's all about mastery learning. Think of taking a driving test. The DMV doesn't care if you're a better driver than the guy in line next to you. They only care if you can parallel park without hitting an orange cone. It's an individual evaluation measured against a fixed, specific standard.
Now, to gather all that data, we generally rely on two types of instruments. Standardized tests literally mean they are brought to a fixed level. The procedures, the apparatus, the uniform scoring, the rigid timing constraints, the directions, they're all identical whether you're taking the test in New York or New Mexico. Conversely, teacher-made tests are super adaptable. They're crafted for specific, localized classroom needs without all that rigid standardization. This allows teachers to evaluate exactly what they just taught in the exact way they taught it.
So we've traveled from the narrow, concrete reality of a single test question all the way out to the broad, philosophical realm of evaluation, quality control, and true mastery, which leaves us here. The next time you're sitting at a desk, listening to that clock tick, staring down at a piece of paper, I want you to ask yourself this: is your true potential actually being evaluated today, or are you just being measured? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll see you next time.